April 1963. The hills of St. James, Jamaica. The air hangs heavy with the scent of damp earth and ripening fruit. Everywhere the eye turns, the hibiscus is in full bloom. Petals spread wide and vibrant, red as a warning against the deep green canopy. It is a landscape that breathes peace, a deceptive calm that masks the tremors beneath the soil. The sun beats down on the winding paths, illuminating the dew on the leaves and the stillness of the morning. But in these hills, the silence is not empty. It is a held breath. The valley waits. The wind shifts, carrying the faint, metallic tang of distant exhaust and the rhythmic crunch of boots on gravel. This is the jewel of the coast, a place where the earth provides and the spirit finds room to grow. Yet, the beauty is a thin veil. The red of the flowers is no longer just color. It is a signal. The storm is moving into the valley, and the hills of St. James are about to become a hunting ground. These men were not soldiers of war. They were farmers, fathers, and prophets. In the small clearings between the hills, they worked the soil with calloused hands, planting yams and cassava under the morning sun. Their lives were defined by the rhythm of the seasons and the teachings of their faith. They had made a choice that the colonial order could not forgive. They chose Locks over lies and Africa over Babylon. They walked with a steady, unhurried gait, their eyes fixed on the horizon of their own making. At midday, they gathered under the shade of a breadfruit tree to share water and scripture. They spoke in low, resonant tones about the land, the ancestors, and the necessity of self-reliance. To the outside observer, they were simply men working the earth. To the architects of the pigmentocracy, they were an existential crisis. They were living proof that a black man could be poor, unashamed, and entirely free from the psychological shackles of the British Crown. They were the heartbeat of the valley, deeply rooted in the soil, unaware that their very existence had already been marked for destruction by those who feared their independence. Far from the quiet hills, in the sterile, wood-paneled offices of Kingston, the decision was finalized. Prime Minister Alexander Bustamante sat behind a heavy mahogany desk, the weight of colonial legacy pressing down on his shoulders. He did not see men or fathers. He saw a contagion. He picked up a fountain pen, the nib scratching sharply against the official parchment. The order was drafted with clinical precision, a document designed to erase. It traveled through telegraph lines and radio waves, cutting through the humid air of the island like a blade. The message reached the local stations in St. James by late afternoon. The officers read the text, their faces hardening as the directive became clear. It was a mandate of total eradication. "Bring in all Rastas," the order stated, "dead or alive." The words hung in the air of the station, stripping away the pretense of law and replacing it with the raw mechanics of a hunt. Outside, the police began loading rifles and checking the chambers of their sidearms. The hills would soon echo with something other than the wind. The order did not just authorize violence. It sanctioned a ghost story. For decades, the official records of the Jamaican state remained silent, as if the events in the hills of St. James had never occurred. Textbooks ignored the smoke rising from the valleys. Politicians spoke of progress while the ground beneath them held the remains of those who refused to bow. Today, we peel back the layers of that silence to confront the history that was buried alive. This is the Coral Gardens Massacre. It was not a riot, nor a simple clash of factions. It was a systematic hunt, a state-sponsored campaign to excise a specific identity. 8 months after Jamaica celebrated its independence, its own government turned its machinery against its most defiant citizens. The state did not just kill. It attempted to delete the memory of the victims. It forced the survivors to carry the weight of their trauma. We are here to exhume the facts, to name the perpetrators, and to recognize the scale of the crime hidden in the shadows of the hills. To grasp why the state turned its guns on its own, we must look at the architecture of power. Independence in 1962 did not dismantle the colonial machine. It merely changed the hands on the levers. Jamaica had inherited a pigmentocracy, a rigid racial hierarchy where social status and political authority were tied directly to skin tone. The light-skinned elite, who had long served as the local administrators for the British Crown, stepped seamlessly into the vacuum left by the departing empire. They did not see themselves as black, but as the civilized custodians of a European order. They inherited the laws, the courts, and the deep-seated fear of the plantation era. For this new ruling class, the Rastafari were not just citizens. They were a structural anomaly. They were the living proof that a person could be black, impoverished, and yet entirely unbowed by the colonial gaze. The massacre was not a random act of police brutality. It was a calculated defense of a system that demanded total conformity to the old colonial hierarchy. The elite looked at the Rastafari and saw a mirror they desperately wanted to shatter. In the eyes of the ruling class, every man with locks was a walking indictment of their own complicity. They had spent generations aligning themselves with European standards, trading their heritage for a seat at the table of the former masters. The Rastafari, however, refused the trade. They claimed an identity that required no validation from the state, no permission from the church, and no approval from the colonial remnants. This was not merely a difference of opinion. It was a fundamental rejection of the elite's entire worldview. To the men in power, the Rastafari were a dangerous contagion. They were proof that one could be black, poor, and entirely unashamed. By simply existing in their own truth, they rendered the elite's struggle for colonial acceptance look pathetic and hollow. The state could tolerate poverty, and it could tolerate dissent, but it could not tolerate a black body that refused to feel inferior. This pride was the ultimate transgression. It stripped away the mask of the new nation, revealing that the old colonial hierarchy was still the only law that mattered. The Rastafari were not just a group of people. They were an existential threat to the very idea of a black nation built on white foundations. The state reached a terminal conclusion. A black body that will not submit is a machine that must be dismantled. This was the brutal logic of the new order. If the elite could not command the spirit, they would break the vessel. They viewed the Rastafari not as citizens with rights, but as a malfunction in the national design. The policy was stripped of all pretense. It was a binary choice: total assimilation or total erasure. To the government, a man who grew his hair in defiance was a man who had declared war. They did not see a farmer or a prophet. They saw a piece of property that had slipped its leash. The logic of the plantation was resurrected. If a slave refused to work, the whip fell. If a Rasta refused to bow, the state responded with the full weight of its police force. They believed that by targeting the most visible symbols of this defiance, they could terrify the rest into silence. It was a calculated effort. If you would not be a subject, you would be a target. The logic was absolute, and the violence was the only language left. The violence did not happen in a vacuum. It was staged against the backdrop of a nation selling its soul to the highest bidder. Along the northern coast, the jewel of Jamaica shimmered for the world to see. Here, the air smelled of imported rum and expensive tobacco. White sand beaches were manicured daily to ensure no trace of the island's true history remained. Tourists arrived by the thousands, seeking a paradise that had been scrubbed clean of any discomfort. They came for the sun, the sea, and the illusion of a docile, welcoming people. But just a few miles inland, the hills of St. James told a different story. There, the soil was hard, the water was scarce, and the people were forgotten by the architects of the new economy. The elite knew that their golden egg, the tourism trade, could not survive. If the world saw the reality of the interior, a defiant black man in the hills was a bad advertisement. He was a crack in the pristine facade of the resort experience. To protect the flow of foreign currency, the state decided that the hills had to be pacified. The spark was a dispute over land at the Rose Hall estate. A police officer died in the ensuing chaos. For a government desperate to maintain its image, this was not a crime to be solved. It was an opportunity to be seized. Alexander Bustamante did not hesitate. He reached into the dusty archives of the British Empire and pulled out the oldest, most effective weapon. In the colonial playbook, collective punishment. The state stopped looking for a culprit and started hunting a community. The death of one officer became the justification for a scorched earth policy that ignored individual guilt entirely. They declared that the entire movement was responsible for the act of a few. This was the mechanism of the plantation system reborn. The government authorized the police to treat every member of the faith as an enemy combatant. They turned the state machinery against its own people. There was no investigation, no due process, and no room for innocence. The order was absolute. The hunt began in earnest. The hunt required no evidence. only a glance. To the police, the definition of a criminal was no longer based on a file or a warrant. It was determined by the hair on a man's head. The locks became a scarlet letter, a visual marker of defiance that the state deemed intolerable. If you walked the roads of St. James with your hair grown in the natural way, you were an automatic suspect. The police did not need to ask questions. They saw the hair and saw an enemy of the state. This was the ultimate form of profiling, the criminalization of a spiritual existence. Officers swept through the villages with a singular, brutal mandate. They stopped men in the fields, at the markets, and in their own homes. They did not look for weapons or stolen property. They looked for the sign of the faith. When they found it, they acted with calculated cruelty. Survivors would later recount the terror of being pinned to the ground while police used rusty scissors and jagged shards of glass to shear their heads. It was a systematic stripping of dignity, a public ritual intended to break the spirit of the movement. By turning a physical appearance into a crime, the violence was not an aberration. It was the logical conclusion of a system that had never truly been dismantled. When the British flag came down, the structure of power remained intact, merely changing hands. The local elite had inherited more than just the land and the offices of government. They had inherited the slave code, and they had internalized it with terrifying precision. They viewed the Rastafari not as fellow citizens, but as a fundamental threat to the order they had fought to preserve. To these men in power, the existence of a black body that refused to submit was an intolerable contradiction. They saw the poverty of the hills and the defiance of the people, and they reacted with the same cold brutality that had defined the plantation era. The new government did not need the British to dictate their actions. They had become the architects of their own oppression. The whips had been replaced by police batons, and the overseers were now their own countrymen, yet the objective remained identical. The state draped itself in the colors of a new flag, yet the machinery of control remained unchanged. National pride became the ultimate mask, a carefully curated narrative designed to hide the blood spilled in the hills. To the government, the Coral Gardens massacre was not a tragedy to be mourned, but a problem of public relations to be managed. They sold the world a vision of paradise, a land of rum, rhythm, and sun. While the reality of their governance was defined by the systematic erasure of their own people, this was the true cost of their independence. It was a theater of sovereignty where the actors played the part of liberators while acting as the new overseers. They demanded loyalty to the state, yet they defined that state by the exclusion of the poor and the unashamed. By branding the victims as enemies of progress, the elite turned the massacre into a footnote, a necessary sacrifice for the sake of economic stability. They buried the records, silenced the witnesses, and forced the survivors to carry the weight of their trauma in the shadows. The crime was not just the violence itself, but the deliberate, calculated effort to erase it from the national memory. They wanted a nation that looked forward. The fuse was lit at the Rose Hall estate, a place where the history of the plantation still hung heavy in the air. It was a jewel of the tourism coast, a sprawling expanse of land that represented the wealth the elite were desperate to protect. In April of 1963, the silence of the hills was shattered by a dispute that had been simmering for years. Farmers who had worked the soil for generations found their access to the land blocked by new fences and legal threats. They were not looking for a fight. They were looking for the right to sustain their families. But at Rose Hall, every inch of dirt was a battleground. Tempers flared near the estate boundaries as the farmers confronted the overseers. Voices rose, tools were gripped tight. The estate managers viewed the farmers as trespassers, while the farmers viewed the estate as a stolen legacy. It was a localized conflict. The standoff at the gate was no longer just about land. It was the moment the state decided that the defiance of the poor had finally gone too far. The air at the estate gate turned sharp as the police moved in to clear the path. There was no negotiation, only the cold command to disperse. When the farmers stood their ground, the officer stepped forward, hand on his sidearm, eyes scanning the crowd for a target. A single shove escalated into a desperate scramble. In the chaos of the struggle, a shot rang out, echoing off the stone walls of the estate. The officer collapsed, his hand dropping from his weapon as he hit the dirt. Zealands followed, heavy and absolute, broken only by the sound of retreating footsteps. The state did not wait for an investigation. They did not seek context. They saw a fallen officer and immediately reached for the colonial playbook. The death was not treated as a crime to be solved, but as a strategic opening to be exploited. Within hours, the narrative was rewritten. The farmers were no longer citizens in a land dispute. They were labeled insurgents. The government had its excuse, a blood-stained justification. The machinery of the state began to grind, turning the tragedy of a single death into the fuel for a systematic campaign of terror that would soon sweep across the entire valley. The order from the capital reached the stations before the sun had set. Prime Minister Alexander Bustamante did not hesitate. His directive was absolute. Bring in all Rastas, dead or alive. The hunt was no longer contained to the estate. It was now a national mandate. From the concrete streets of Kingston, police units mobilized, loading into trucks. They moved with a predatory focus, their presence turning the city into a grid of checkpoints. But the sweep did not stop at the urban perimeter. The trucks turned toward the hills, climbing the winding roads into the rural valleys where the farmers lived. The silence of the countryside was replaced by the roar of engines and the harsh glare of spotlights cutting through the night. Police squads fanned out across the terrain, moving through the brush. They were looking for a specific mark, the locks of the Rastafari. The state had turned its own geography into a trap, and the net was closing fast. There was no sanctuary left in the hills. The rural settlements offered no cover. Police squads moved house to house, dragging men from their beds and fields. There were no warrants, no questions, and no room for defense. The scale of the operation was staggering. By dawn, the local holding cells were overflowing, forcing officers to pack men into makeshift pens and open-air enclosures. The sound of heavy boots on dirt paths became the rhythm of the valley. Men were lined up against walls, hands raised, while trucks idled nearby, waiting to transport the growing mass of detainees. The sheer volume of arrests turned the local police stations into bottlenecks. Officers worked in shifts, processing individuals with a mechanical indifference. Every man with locks was shoved into the back of a transport vehicle, the metal cages rattling as they were hauled toward the coast. The roads were clogged with police convoys, a constant stream of state power. The aggression reached a fever pitch, leaving behind only the terrified silence of those who remained hidden in the brush, watching the dust clouds rise. The transport truck stopped at a makeshift processing center near the coast. The doors swung open, and the men were forced into a courtyard under the harsh glare of floodlights. There was no processing paperwork here, only a deliberate campaign of erasure. An officer stepped forward, holding a pair of heavy, industrial scissors, the blades pitted with deep patches of rust. Beside him, another officer produced a jagged shard of broken glass, its edges uneven and sharp. They did not cut with precision, they hacked. The first man was shoved to his knees, his head forced back. The rusty blades bit into his scalp, pulling and tearing at the roots rather than slicing through the hair. The sound of hair snapping under the dull metal was audible over the shouting. When the scissors failed to move, the glass shard was used to saw through the thick, matted strands. Blood welled, skin tore, men dragged inward. The ground beneath them turned dark with the weight of their shorn hair, a pile of discarded identity growing with every passing minute. The police worked with a cold, rhythmic intensity, leaving each man bleeding and exposed, his physical connection to his faith severed by the very tools meant to degrade him. The silence that followed the shearing was heavier than the violence that preceded it. Each man stood in the dirt, hands trembling as they reached up to touch the raw, uneven skin of their scalps. The protective weight of their identity was gone, replaced by the stinging bite of the coastal wind against exposed nerves. They looked at one another, but the faces they saw were strangers. The state had not just removed hair, it had attempted to excise the very core of their existence. One man stared at the ground, his fingers tracing the jagged patches where the glass had gouged his skin, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. There was no defiance left in their posture, only the hollow ache of a profound spiritual theft. They were forced to stand in lines, heads bowed, while the guards circled them with mocking laughter. The humiliation was total. Every man felt the sudden, terrifying exposure of being stripped of his armor in a world that demanded total submission. They were no longer prophets or fathers, they were reduced to objects. The humiliation was not the end, it was the clearing of the stage. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the guards shifted their posture. their laughter replaced by a chilling mechanical efficiency. The 6 men were separated from the rest, shoved toward the edge of the clearing where the trees grew thick and dark. There was no trial, no pretense of justice, and no room for mercy. The order from the top was absolute. The threat had to be extinguished. One by one, the men were forced to their knees in the soft, damp earth. The sound of a single gunshot cracked through the valley, sharp and final, followed immediately by the dull thud of a body hitting the ground. The guards did not hesitate. They moved with the practiced rhythm of men performing a necessary chore. Another shot, another fall. The air grew heavy with the scent of cordite and wet soil. Each life was extinguished to preserve the fragile colonial hierarchy. By the time the 6th man collapsed, the clearing had gone deathly quiet. The state had secured its order, but the cost was etched into the soil. The bodies were not left for the vultures. They were dragged into the brush, hidden beneath layers of dirt and debris, as if the earth itself could be forced to swallow the evidence. The guards moved with frantic, calculated haste. They scrubbed blood from the rocks and gathered spent casings, treating the site not as a graveyard but as a public relations liability. Montego Bay was only miles away. The elite knew that tourists would not come for rum and white sand if they knew what lay in the hills. The massacre had to be erased before the first cruise ship docked at the harbor. Journalists were steered away, told of minor skirmishes. The government machine shifted into high gear, burying the truth under layers of official reports. They needed the world to see a paradise. Every witness was intimidated. Every record was shredded. The state decided that the economic golden egg was worth more than its people. By the next morning, the sun rose over a pristine coast. The secret was safely buried beneath the silence of a nation that chose profit. The survivors returned to their homes, but they did not return to their lives. They carried the weight of the massacre in the marrow of their bones, a secret that curdled into a permanent, suffocating dread. Every time a police cruiser passed on the road, their pulses spiked, their hands trembled, and they instinctively retreated into the shadows of their own doorways. The state had not just killed their brothers, it had murdered their ability to exist in the open. For 54 years, they walked the streets of their own country like ghosts. They could not speak of the blood on the rocks or the faces of the men who pulled the triggers. To speak was to invite the same fate. They watched as the world celebrated the island as a paradise, while they lived in a private hell of suppressed memory. They saw the government officials who signed the orders walk free, while they were branded as the criminals. This was not a temporary trauma. It was a slow-motion erasure of the soul. They aged in the silence, their voices growing thin and brittle, their stories locked behind teeth that refused to part. The state had effectively weaponized time, waiting for the witnesses to wither away so the truth could die with them. They were forced to watch their children grow up in a land that denied their history. In 2017, the state finally broke its silence. Prime Minister Andrew Holness stood before the cameras and offered a formal apology for the events at Coral Gardens. He spoke of healing and reconciliation, his voice steady as he announced a trust fund of 10 million Jamaican dollars to be distributed among the survivors and their descendants. The cameras flashed, the headlines were written, and the government checked the box for progress. But the math tells a different story. When you divide that sum by the hundreds of men who were hunted, beaten, and displaced, the result is a fraction of a life. It is not a reparation. It is a receipt for a debt the state never intended to pay in full. The survivors looked at the numbers and saw the truth. The value of their suffering had been quantified, discounted, and discarded. This was not an act of justice. It was a final, calculated insult, a bureaucratic gesture designed to close a file that had remained open for 54 years. They were offered pennies for the decades of trauma, for the homes lost, and for the brothers who never returned from the hills. The state had waited until the witnesses were broken or buried, then handed a check. The timing of the apology was no accident. It arrived in 2017, long after the hills had grown quiet, and the primary witnesses had been lowered into the earth. The government waited until the voices that could demand accountability were silenced by time and infirmity. They stood at the podium and spoke to empty chairs, offering words of contrition to ghosts who could no longer hear them. This was a masterclass in political theater. By the time the state found its conscience, the men who had been hunted, the men who had been sheared and beaten, were mostly gone. The apology was not a bridge to the past. It was a wall built to separate the present from the crimes of the state. They apologized to the grandchildren, knowing that the direct victims could not stand up to challenge the narrative. It is a calculated strategy. Wait until the evidence is buried, wait until the pain has faded, and then perform the ritual of remorse. This is the neo-colonial playbook in its purest form. Weaponized patience. The strategy is simple, cold, and effective. You do not fight the truth when it is fresh and burning. You wait for it to cool. You wait for the survivors to die, for the memories to blur, and for the witnesses to be silenced by the natural passage of years. By the time the state finally decides to acknowledge the crime, the victims are no longer present to hold them to account. They are not there to point at the scars or name the men who held the scissors. The playbook dictates that you apologize only when the apology can no longer trigger a trial. It is a cynical transfer of debt from the perpetrators to the descendants, leaving the younger generation to inherit a hollowed-out version of history. The state preserves its image by performing a ritual of remorse that requires no real restitution. They trade a few $1 million for a clean slate, ensuring the records remain sanitized and the power structures remain untouched. It is a masterclass in evasion. We must stop confusing the lowering of a flag with the dismantling of a system. Coral Gardens serves as a brutal, undeniable proof that flag independence is mere theater when the structures beneath remain untouched. The machinery of the state did not change. It simply changed hands. The same colonial logic was adopted by the local elite. They inherited the offices, the courts, and the police, but they kept the hierarchy intact. This is the great deception. But if the law still targets the same bodies, if the land remains locked away, then the revolution remains incomplete. Independence is not a date on a calendar or a color on a banner. It is a fundamental shift in who holds power. As long as the colonial architecture of the state stands, the massacre is not just a dark chapter, it is a recurring possibility. We are trapped in a performance of freedom, while the old chains are simply painted in national colors. The echoes of 1963 are not merely historical. They are audible in the boardrooms and classrooms of 2024. If we believe the era of persecution ended with the apology, we are ignoring the reality of the present. Today, the suppression of Rastafari identity has shifted from the hills to the office cubicle and the school gate. Young students are still told their hair is a distraction, a violation of dress codes that were written to favor a colonial aesthetic. They face suspension and public shaming for the very locks that were once forcibly shorn by police. In the workplace, the bias remains just as sharp. Professionals are passed over for promotions or denied employment because their appearance is deemed unprofessional. This is not a coincidence. It is the persistence of a pigmentocracy that equates black, natural, and unashamed identity with chaos. The institutions have simply traded the police baton for the policy manual. The target has remained the same for 60 years, the black body that refuses to submit. Beyond the office and the classroom, the soil itself remains a battlefield. The Coral Gardens massacre was ignited by a dispute over land, and that fire has never been extinguished. It smolders in the thousands of acres still held by the heirs of the colonial elite, while the descendants of those who worked the earth remain landless. To own land is to possess the power of self-determination, and that is exactly what the state has denied the people for generations. We see the same pattern repeated. Farmers are pushed off their plots, their claims ignored by courts that prioritize corporate interests over ancestral rights. This is not a relic of the past. It is the active mechanism of current dispossession. When the state refuses to resolve the land question, it ensures that the cycle of poverty continues. The massacre was not an isolated event. It was a violent enforcement of a land use policy that still dictates who belongs and who is an intruder on their own soil. The cycle is not broken. It is merely waiting for the next spark. We have looked back at the hills of St. James, but the mirror is now turned toward you. The Coral Gardens massacre was never just about 1963. It was a blueprint for how a state discards those it cannot control. If we stop at sympathy, we have already failed the martyrs. The question is no longer just about the past. It is about the present. Who are the people being hunted today? Which communities are currently being squeezed by policy, erased by poverty, and silenced by the machinery of the state. Look at your own streets. Look at the neighborhoods where the police presence is a threat rather than a service. Look at the families fighting for the land their ancestors cleared, now facing eviction by corporate interests. The same logic that hunted the Rastafari is still active, still hungry, and still looking for its next target. We cannot afford to wait another 54 years for an apology that will only come when the victims are gone. Accountability must be demanded now. It must be demanded by you. It is not enough to know the history. You must be the wall that stops the cycle from repeating. Take this truth into your homes, your workplaces. Speak the names. Demand the change. The time for waiting is over.